"I signed the papers this morning," she said. The words landed between us and stayed there, heavy, unfinished. I remember the hum of the refrigerator, the way the light over the sink flickered once and steadied itself. My mouth opened before my thoughts caught up. So I stopped. Whatever I'd planned to say had already aged out of usefulness. She didn't look at me. She was tracing the rim of her coffee mug with her thumb, slow and careful, like time itself had decided to move without asking us. In that moment, I understood something I'd been avoiding for months. This wasn't a threat or a tactic. It was a fact, and facts don't wait for you to be ready. I stood there, holding the rest of my sentence, realizing that whatever came next would change the shape of my life in ways I couldn't reverse. Before that morning, before the papers and the quiet finality in her voice, my life looked stable from the outside. Predictable, respectable. I was the kind of man people described as steady, and for a long time I took that as a compliment. I had worked at the same firm for over 20 years, paid the mortgage on time, fixed things around the house on weekends. I believed consistency was the same thing as care. We had met in our early 30s, both carrying the light scars of previous lives. She was precise in the way she spoke, thoughtful with her emotions. I was more reserved, someone who believed that love showed itself through presence rather than words. We didn't rush into anything. Our relationship grew slowly, layered with routines that felt comforting rather than dull. Coffee together every morning, grocery shopping on Sundays, dinners eaten at the table, phones face down, television off. For a long time, I thought that was enough. We never had the kind of marriage people write songs about. There were no dramatic fights, no slammed doors. Our conflicts were quieter, almost polite. Disappointments expressed in pauses. Needs hinted at instead of stated outright. I told myself that the absence of chaos meant we were doing something right. What I didn't realize was that silence can be just as loud when it goes on long enough. As the years passed, I began to notice small changes. She laughed less at my stories. Our conversations became transactional. Who was picking up what time we needed to leave, whether the car needed servicing. When she talked about her day, I listened, but only halfway. My attention was divided between emails I hadn't answered and thoughts about work waiting for me the next morning. I was physically present, but something essential in me had started to withdraw. I didn't see it as neglect at the time. I saw it as responsibility. I was providing, planning, maintaining. I believed love was something solid, something that didn't need constant checking. I assumed that if there was a problem, it would announce itself clearly. I didn't understand that distance often grows quietly, fed by good intentions and postponed conversations. Looking back now, I can trace the slow erosion. The nights she went to bed before me, the way she stopped reaching for my hand in public, the careful neutrality in her voice when she talked about the future. Each moment felt minor on its own, easy to explain away. Together, they formed a pattern I wasn't ready to name. At that stage of my life, I thought time was abundant, that there would always be another weekend to talk, another vacation to reconnect, another chance to do better. I didn't yet understand that time, once ignored long enough, stops being neutral. It begins to take sides. The incident didn't arrive as a single explosion. It came disguised as practicality. It started with a conversation she asked to have on a Tuesday night, after dinner, when the dishes were still drying on the rack. She said she needed to talk about something important, and I remember feeling mildly irritated, not alarmed, just inconvenienced. Important conversations, in my mind, were for weekends, when there was time to fix things. I told her I was tired. She nodded and said calmly, that was part of the problem. That sentence should have stopped me. Instead, I defended myself. I talked about work, about stress, about how this phase would pass. I spoke for several minutes without realizing she hadn't interrupted once. When I finally paused, she said, I don't think you hear how alone I've been. I was the first time she used that word. Alone. I responded the way I always did, by explaining. I listed what I did for us, for our life, the stability, the planning, the sacrifices I thought I'd made quietly and consistently. I expected her to feel reassured, maybe even grateful. Instead, her face closed in on itself, like something retreating for protection. She told me she had tried for years to bridge the distance, that she had asked in subtle ways, then clearer ones, that each time she brought up how disconnected she felt, I treated it like a problem to manage rather than a feeling to sit with. I didn't deny any of it. I simply said I hadn't realized it was that serious. That's when she said something I still hear in my head. It became serious because you didn't realize. A few weeks later, she suggested counseling. I agreed immediately, relieved to have something concrete to do. Sessions were scheduled, calendars adjusted. I told myself this was the turning point. What I didn't notice was how carefully she managed her expectations. She spoke honestly in those sessions, but without hope in her voice, like someone documenting damage rather than trying to prevent it. One evening, after a session that ended in a long silence between us, she told me she had spoken to a lawyer. She said it the same way someone might say they'd made a doctor's appointment. No anger, no accusation, just information. I felt the room tilt. I asked why she would do that when we were working on things. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and said she wasn't working on things anymore. She was preparing for the possibility that nothing would change. That was the point of no return. Not because she talked to a lawyer, but because I finally understood something irreversible had shifted. The relationship I thought we were repairing had already entered a different phase, one where love was no longer assumed, only evaluated. I promised to do better. I meant it. I started paying closer attention, asking questions, staying present. But urgency, when it arrives too late, carries a particular kind of panic. My efforts felt frantic, compressed into weeks what should have been done over years. She noticed. She appreciated it. And she remained distant. One night, she told me she needed space. Not a break, she clarified. Space to think clearly, without my sudden intensity clouding things. I nodded, even helped pack a small bag. I told myself this was temporary, that people who love each other don't walk away quietly. What I didn't admit was that I had waited too long to take her seriously. By the time I decided the situation couldn't continue, she had already accepted that it hadn't been working for a long time. The weeks after she asked for space stretched into something heavier than absence. The house didn't feel empty in a dramatic way. It felt paused, like a room waiting for someone who wasn't sure they were coming back. Her side of the closet stayed intact. Her toothbrush remained in the holder. I told myself those details meant something. That they were signs, not habits, she hadn't bothered to change yet. We spoke occasionally, short messages about logistics, bills, mail. I tried to keep my tone measured, reasonable. Every message I sent went through a quiet internal filter. Don't push, don't plead, don't say the wrong thing. I thought restraint was respect. In truth, it was fear. I was afraid that if I asked directly where we stood, I wouldn't like the answer. When we did meet in person, it was almost worse. We sat across from each other like careful acquaintances. I noticed how composed she was, how her emotions no longer spilled into the room. I, on the other hand, was full of things I wanted to say and no sense of timing. I apologized, properly this time. Not defensively, not with explanations attached. I told her I saw my part in the distance between us. I told her I was changing. She listened. She always listened. And then she said gently that change and repair aren't the same thing. That I was finally showing up, but she was already tired of waiting. Her honesty didn't feel cruel. It felt final. I started replaying memories, searching for missed exits. I remembered moments when she had reached for connection and I had postponed it. Times she had asked simple questions about my day, my thoughts, my fears, and I had answered efficiently instead of truthfully. None of it had seemed urgent at the time. Now every detail carried weight. Sleep became inconsistent. Some nights I lay awake rehearsing conversations that would never happen. Other nights I slept too deeply, as if my body was trying to escape what my mind couldn't. Friends noticed something was off. I told them we were figuring things out. The phrase sounded cooperative, hopeful. It wasn't a lie so much as an outdated version of the truth. I made mistakes in this period. I pushed when I shouldn't have. I sent long messages that tried to compress years of reflection into paragraphs. I showed up with clarity she hadn't asked for yet. Each time, I could see her withdraw a little more. Not in anger, but in self-preservation. One afternoon, she asked me to meet her to discuss practical matters. The word practical should have prepared me. Instead, I walked in carrying optimism like a fragile object. She had a folder with her, neatly organized. I recognized the posture immediately. Decisive, contained, resolved. It was the same posture she used when she had already made up her mind at work. She told me she had decided to move forward, that living in uncertainty was costing her something she couldn't afford anymore. I asked if there was anything I could do differently. She said no, not now. That the changes I was making were real, but they had arrived after she had already grieved the relationship. That sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. Grief implies an ending that has already been accepted. I realized then that we were no longer escalating toward a resolution together. We were moving on separate timelines, and mine was painfully behind. I left that meeting understanding something I hadn't before. Effort doesn't always equal impact, and remorse doesn't rewind time. The pressure wasn't building toward reconciliation. It was building toward an ending I was finally forced to face. The morning she signed the papers, I didn't know yet. I was moving through my routine on autopilot, convinced that if I stayed calm and functional, something inside all this would stabilize. I made coffee. I checked the news. I answered a few emails. Ordinary actions, performed with the quiet desperation of someone trying to keep the world intact through habit alone. When she came over later that day, there was no tension in her posture, no visible weight. That should have warned me. People don't carry themselves lightly when they're undecided. We stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd built years of shared life through small, forgettable moments. She spoke first. I signed the papers this morning. I started to respond before the sentence had fully registered. The rest never formed. I felt it then, clearly and completely. There was nothing left to negotiate. No angle, no argument, no emotional leverage that wouldn't cheapen what we'd already lost. She waited, not impatiently, but with a kind of respect that made it worse. I realized she wasn't bracing herself anymore. She had already crossed whatever internal threshold this moment represented. I was standing in the aftermath, trying to pretend it was still a turning point. Something inside me wanted to plead, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, to tell her that I finally understood, that I could name every mistake now, that I was no longer confused about what mattered. But another part of me recognized the truth. Understanding is not the same as undoing. I asked one last question, quietly. Not to change her mind, but to understand the final shape of things. She told me she had reached a point where staying required more of her than leaving. That sentence didn't accuse me. It simply placed the cost where it belonged. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I respected the clarity. I felt something settle then, a heavy, irreversible acceptance. This was the consequence of years of delay, of assuming presence was enough, of believing love could survive indefinitely on good intentions alone. When she left, the house didn't echo. It absorbed the silence. I stood there longer than necessary, holding the weight of what I could no longer change. The choice had been made, not by force, not in anger, but through a slow accumulation of moments I hadn't treated as urgent when they still were. That was the climax, though it didn't look like one from the outside. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet certainty that the life I thought I still had was now officially behind me. After that day, time didn't collapse the way I expected it to. It widened. The hours stretched, unoccupied by conflict or hope, leaving space I didn't know how to fill. The house became quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that asks to be noticed. We handled the separation with the same restraint that had defined the end of our relationship. Emails instead of calls. Decisions made efficiently. A shared history reduced to checklists and signatures. I watched her collect the last of her things one afternoon, moving through the rooms with familiarity, but no hesitation. There was no ceremony to it. That, more than anything, told me she was already living in a different chapter. I began to understand something uncomfortable. The loss hadn't started with the papers. It had started years earlier, in moments that felt harmless at the time. Every postponed conversation. Every evening I chose distraction over attention. The end was simply the moment those choices added up enough to be visible. Living alone forced a kind of honesty I couldn't outsource anymore. There was no one to quietly absorb my absence, no shared routine to soften my disengagement. I noticed how often I avoided stillness, how quickly I reached for structure to avoid feeling. Without realizing it, I had treated emotional presence like a resource to be rationed. Only later did I understand that withholding it doesn't preserve it. It erodes it. Friends asked how I was doing. I said I was adjusting. It was true, but incomplete. I wasn't just adjusting to being alone. I was adjusting to the reality that some real-life experiences don't offer redemption arcs. They offer clarity, and then they move on. Over time, the sharpness of the loss dulled into something quieter. Not relief, not regret exactly. Responsibility. I carried it differently. Not as punishment, but as memory. As a record of who I had been and what that version of me had cost. I don't speak badly of her. There's no need. She told the truth when it mattered, and she acted on it. The consequence belongs to me as much as the ending does. That understanding didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, through repetition, through ordinary days that no longer required me to negotiate my presence. Now, when I think back to that morning, her voice steady, the papers already signed, I don't hear accusation in it anymore. I hear finality. And in that finality, a kind of honesty I wish I had matched sooner. Some choices don't announce themselves as decisive when they're made. They reveal their weight only later, when there's nothing left to argue with. All that remains is the memory, and the responsibility to carry it forward without pretending It could have ended any other way.